For this session, we're going to discuss the rise of the star singer out of the swing era. And you can see my secondary title here is The Unintended Consequences of the AFM Band. AFM is, of course, the American Federation of Musicians. It's the musicians' union. And we'll talk about a very important ban on recording that they instituted, and we'll see that the rise of the star singer is in part an unintended consequence of that ban. As we saw before, just to remind us of where we are with things, during the swing era, the singer was not the leader of the band, hardly ever. In fact, I can't think of any good examples except for maybe Cab Calloway, who only sang on some of the tunes, but was for the most part the conductor for his band. For the most part during the swing era, the leader was an instrumentalist or merely a conductor. So some of the great leaders were like Benny Goodman, who was of course a clarinet player, or the Dorsey brothers, who were both instrumentalists, and Artie Shaw, right? Count Basie's a pianist. The singer was really another of the sidemen, or woman, as the case may be. And what they would do is they'd get up and they'd sing a chorus of the song, and then they'd sit back down, and there would be other solos and so on. They were a featured soloist. They weren't the star of the program. In fact, as we'll see, early on in Frank Sinatra's career, some of his early recordings that later become quite celebrated, like All or Nothing at All, he wasn't even listed on the record jacket, on the description of the recording, because he's just the singer, right? And he's not the main focus. That I believe that was the Tommy Dorsey band, although we'll see in a moment it might have been the Artie Shaw. Either way, he wasn't the focus of the band. He wasn't the important member, right? All that changes in the 1940s, and part of that has to do with this recording ban, that this was an important moment, an important structural shift in the business of music, and it has its effects, as all important shifts in the business of music will have. It has its effects on the aesthetics of music as well. So let's get into it. The decline of the big bands. Many of the bands and band leaders enlisted in the war, and as we saw, Glenn Miller, he went down in a plane in 1944 over the English Channel. Also during this time, obviously, there are shortages in gas and shellac, restrictions on radio ownership, 20% of there was a 20% entertainment tax, 30% on dancing clubs. That's why, as we talked about last time with Western Swing really declines because of this rather exorbitant tax on dancing clubs, right? Clubs with dancing. It doesn't mean literal dancing clubs, just any club that might have dancing got a 30% tax on all their sales, and that's quite exorbitant. And then, of course, there were brownouts, curfews. You couldn't be out past a certain time, and the electricity would be browned out, that it would be turned to a minimum. And people were supposed to turn off their lights, turn off their radios, and so on. This, of course, has a huge impact on the business of music and on these touring groups. The swing bands are major enterprises. We saw, for instance, with the Casa Loma group, that they were all shareholders in their band. Now, most bands didn't work that way. There was a leader, and that leader made a good bit of money and paid the other band members a salary, but it's still a business. The leader had a manager and had a booking agent and so on, and there's a business involved here, and it's not a cheap business. And part of that business has to do with the touring itself, just gas and the shellac of the recordings, the rubber drive. Remember that during World War II there were a series of rubber drives, so rubber is at a premium. They needed it for the war effort. This made maintaining a band very difficult, and it made establishing a new band extremely difficult. So, for instance, Coleman Hawkins, around this time in the early 40s, returns to the U.S. He had been in London for a while, and he returns hoping to start his own big band and have a successful career. And he comes back and he has a hit record with Body and Soul, which, if you haven't already heard it, you should. It's one of the great recordings of jazz, and it's still very much a popular music entry as well. It's not just, jazz is art or whatever. This was a popular recording. And it's a very interesting recording to listen to, because even though it's a quote unquote big band recording, it's really not. It's really just him soloing. He barely even plays the melody. There's a little opening orchestration, but he goes then right into an extended solo where he barely touches on the melody, and plays through. It's a beautiful solo. It's an amazing solo. This wonderful exploration of the registers of the instrument, of arpeggios, really outlining the changes and taking advantage of the body and soul changes, which are quite interesting. Changes here just means the harmonic progression. And then it ends with the group coming back in, and they mess it up. Listen carefully, and you'll hear they don't come back in very well, right? They might have needed to do another take, but the take with his solo was so good that they didn't want to do it again, of course. And this is one of the most celebrated solos in the history of jazz, well worth listening to. So he's got this hit record. The big band element parts of it are perhaps not so great, but the record is a hit. It sold extremely well, and he couldn't make a big band work because that whole style was dying based on these restrictions. Part of what happens then is the ASCAP feud in 1941. NBC, ABC, CBS, and Mutual. Those are the big radio broadcast stations. And as you know, NBC, ABC, CBS, they're also going to be the important television networks soon. So the networks were already established here with the radio system. And you have 4 of them. Actually, strictly speaking, you have 5 because there were 2 NBCs. There was an NBC Red and an NBC Blue, but you don't need to worry about all that. There are basically 4 companies: NBC, ABC, CBS, and Mutual. Now, they wound up fighting with ASCAP over royalties because they didn't want to pay for the tunes that they were broadcasting over the radio. They didn't see any need to. They had paid for the tunes when they bought the record. Now that records, remember that early in the radio days, in the 20s, you didn't play records over the air, right? You had live bands. The beginning of all that, the beginning of having records being played on the radio, we talked about before that had to do in part with the Lindbergh trial. People didn't want to miss any parts of the Lindbergh trial, and it didn't feel right interrupting a live band, so you would play recordings. That way you could just pick up the needle whenever you wanted and tell people the latest news about the Lindbergh trial. So that really changed the whole way that music on the radio operates. But what didn't change is the way it was paid for, right? If I had a band, let's say I run a radio station, I have a band come in and play, I pay the band, they leave, we're done, right? I'm not recording what they played, usually. I'm just broadcasting it over the air, and then another band comes in and I pay them, and so on. Once you start playing records on the air, the same model is what occurs to most of the radio station holders. So they paid for the recording, so they figure they're done. They don't want to pay again and again for mechanical rights, for copyright, right? So they're paying for the purchase, not for the play-by-play of these recordings. And of course, obviously, ASCAP, the American Society of Composers and Publishers, they're going to object to this, right? Because they feel like they're getting ripped off, and rightly so. So every time I play a Duke Ellington song on the radio, because I only buy the record once, every time I play it, I'm making money from the advertisements that I broadcast on the radio, but Duke Ellington's getting none of that. That seems somehow unfair. So ASCAP objects to this and demands that they get paid. Now, meanwhile, the networks create their own publishing company called Broadcast Music Inc., BMI, in 1940. So they are already preparing themselves for the trouble that ASCAP is about to make. And BMI has an open door policy, unlike ASCAP. So you don't have to create scores. You don't have to be officially thought of as some kind of professional composer. You write songs, you can be protected by BMI. So this allows for non-traditional, non-Tin Pan Alley composers to collect royalties, even though they're getting them at a lower rate than an ASCAP composer would get. So in 1941, ASCAP calls a strike. None of their music is to be broadcast on the radio. This kills a huge chunk of the big band repertoire. It's part of what kills swing music. And you can see here some ads about what follows that, right? AFM follows it in August 2nd of 1942. This is the American Federation of Musicians. This is the Musicians Union. And they call a strike against the recording companies. So the composers have already called a strike, or a ban rather, in 1941, and now roughly a year later, the musicians are calling a strike. And the president of that union, James Caesar Petrillo, claims a lack of proper compensation for the musicians. So now it's not just the composers that are objecting to their music being played over and over again. What about the performers? Like, let's think of, I don't know, Wes Osman, right? We're being a little anachronistic here because he's dead by this point, but he didn't write Maple Leaf Rag, but his performance of it was one of the most celebrated ones, right? So let's imagine that his performance of Maple Leaf Rag is getting performed on the radio over and over again. All this ad revenue's coming in. He's not making a buck off of it. Let's say that the radio station somehow try to satisfy the ASCAP people. So the composer, Joplin in this case, is making money. He's also dead, so again, a little anachronistic. But he's making money, or his estate's making money, but Osman's not making any. That seemed unfair to the AFM, and it might seem unfair to us today. So they wanted compensation for radio and jukebox play. Because remember, the musicians used to make all the money from playing on the radio because they were playing live. But now that their recordings are being used, they're not getting compensation any longer. So that means that when Petrillo calls this ban, there's a period here of over a year where no major record company, none of the major labels, can make a recording with union member instrumentalists. But here's where things have an impact on the aesthetics of music. Singers aren't in the musicians' union. They're not in that union. They're not considered musicians. Some of you that are in bands might pick on your singer now and say that he or she's not a musician, right? But they weren't considered musicians as far as the unions were concerned in the 1940s. Singers were part of the actors' union because they used their voice. And a lot of singers did voiceover work and so on. So everyone was covered under the actors' union, not the musicians' union. So the ban didn't apply to them. So the band that, the Dorsey band that Frank Sinatra was working with when the band was called, when the recording band was called, none of them, they're all union members, none of them were allowed to record. But Sinatra is, because he's in the actors' union. Even though at this time he doesn't have much of an acting career, that's not what mattered. All singers were in the actors' union. In 1943, Decca and Capitol signed a new contract with the union, and they were able to record. But Columbia and Victor, the biggest companies, they didn't give in until 1944. So that's 2 years of this effective ban, right? Columbia only put out records by people that were not in the musicians' union for those 2 years, which means largely singers. So this is an era of the rise of singing groups. You have singing groups like the Mills Brothers with their song Paper Doll. Now, one of the Mills Brothers, as you can see here, played a 4-string guitar, right? And so you hear guitar on these things. You sometimes also hear, especially with the ink spots and so on, you'll hear something that sounds like trumpet or something that sounds like bass. That's not trumpet and bass. That's them using their voices, right? So basically what you're dealing with are singers who belong to the actors' union. They're still recording, sometimes using their mouths as alternate instruments, sometimes just strumming the guitar, because this guy, his main vocation is a singer. Even though he's good at guitar, he's not a bad guitarist. That's his main vocation is singing, and so he's in the other union. So the Mills Brothers have several hits, including Paper Doll in 1942. You have various country and western stars like Roy Acuff. They were not part of the musicians union, and nor were they part of ASCAP. So therefore, their music, country music, is getting a lot of play in the 40s. That's part of what makes it so popular during World War II. It's getting a lot of play on the radio. Because the musicians, the composers belong to BMI, so they're allowed to use that music on the broadcast radio. And many of the country musicians are not in the musicians union. They're in the actors union if they're singers, or they're not unionized at all. And so they're able to have more of a presence. And then the other type of musical production that's happening during this time is the crooners, the jazz singers, and singers in general, like Patti Page and Frank Sinatra, where they're singing with choral accompaniment. So there's a period here where these almost Disney-esque recordings are very popular. You have the Mitch Mitchell singers, you have all these different singing groups that are backing solo singers, and sometimes you just have these choral records, but you have these singing groups that are creating these fairly lush orchestrations, these lush arrangements to back singers, and this is the main form of recording. These three avenues are the main form of recording for basically the period between 1941 and 44. This, by the way, for those of you who are jazz fans, you know that this is the period in which bebop is really coming together, right? And many of us complain about not having good recordings for the very early days, the very early years of bebop, and that's because they belong to the Musicians Union. They couldn't record. One of the earliest recordings we have of bebop is just a recording that was made with a small recording studio in a hotel room where Charlie Parker was staying. It sounds not that great as a recording, but that's one of the few glimpses we get of these early days of one of the most important genres in jazz, right? One of the most important languages in jazz. So this recording band had a huge impact on the history of music, our understanding of that history, and its recorded presence. So various changes in the industry, right? We talked about Martin Block in the before, and the use of recordings on the radio, and that was an important moment with the Lindbergh trial. Now we see other issues. For instance, Todd Stortz, and I want you to know that name, most likely to be on the next quiz. Todd Stortz was a DJ in Omaha, Nebraska, and he begins top 40 programming in the very early 50s. And this is a major change here. So we also have the rise of payola. We have, after World War II, the use of magnetic tape, which of course allows for editing and overdubbing. Let's talk a little bit about that. Well, let's first talk about top 40 and define what that is. So what Stortz did, and you can see this is his obituary that we're looking at, and you can see this as he changed the way we think about radio. And the idea here is that a top 40 programming is one in which, for the most part, the DJs don't have a whole lot of say, right? It's whatever the top 40 selling records of that week are, and you just play them basically in a loop all day. And that way, why would people want to listen to this? Because that way, 40 songs takes a while to get through them, and the idea is you tune in, you're going to hear the most famous songs, the ones that you probably want to hear, the earworms. You're going to hear them over the course of the day, and if you're listening to it for a few hours, it'll take a few hours to get through all 40, right? So you're going to hear the biggest hits. It also takes out a lot of the thought for programming. It's kind of mindless programming, but it's reinforcing the popularity of the already popular and making it more popular in essence. Now, payola comes into this as well, because how are we judging what are the top 40? There's no standard way in the early 50s to do that. There are methods that they use, but there's room for a little bit of fakery, right? So sometimes these DJs will promote things as a top 40 hit that technically are not really top 40 hits. And sometimes they're being paid to do that. That's what payola means. They're being bribed. And then what happens, though? If I start playing something and I say, oh, this is one of the top 40 hits in the country, pretty soon it will be. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. Now, magnetic tape is the most important of the innovations that we're talking about, and this is really before the early 50s. This is right after World War II, because it was the Germans largely who developed the advances in the technology of using magnetic tape. Magnetic tape is exactly what it sounds like. There are these little granules on it that get magnetized when you're recording. They shape themselves in a certain way, and the tape deck reads that in order to reproduce sound. Let's look at the next slide to continue this conversation. And Les Paul is going to be one of our important figures here. Basically, what it allows you to do, magnetic tape, is all sorts of things. But the Nazis used it for interrogation. They used it to tape their interrogations instead of taking minutes or whatever. You have recordings of them, right? So when the war ended, as you may or may not know, when wars end, often a lot of the patents of the losing country become forfeit. That means that the company that developed the magnetic tape technology in Germany, they didn't have any rights to it anymore. So the Americans just take the patent and they don't have to pay for it, right? So the Ampex company is one of the important ones that really develops. They started in 1948, but they had already been, the people working there already had been developing advances in tape by taking these patents from the Germans. And of course, as you know, tape allows you to do all sorts of things. You can overdub. You can splice it, right? Let's say you make a mistake and you do a second take, but you want to use the first half of the first take. You just cut it and you tie it to the half of the second half of the song, so that you get the good take of the first half and the good take of the second half. You can also overdub in the sense of splicing horizontally. It doesn't have to be just vertically. You can play things backwards. You can slow it down and speed it up. You can manipulate it in all sorts of ways that you can't manipulate recordings that go directly to disk. And so what quickly happens is, as you probably know, but I'll say it anyway, recordings are no longer made the way they had been, where you're directly carving into a disc. Rather, what you're doing is you are taping. You're creating a recording on the magnetic tape, and then you dub that down to the disc. Because albums are usually still how people are buying music. They're not buying cassettes very often, not yet. So you're dubbing the thing that you've done on a cassette tape, where you can multi-track, where you can do all sorts of things that you can't do with records, and then you dub it down onto the shellac, onto the record. One of the important figures in this is Les Paul, the guitarist, and obviously someone who also designed guitars, the Les Paul guitar. Starting in 1947, he began multi-tracked recordings. At first, he was using discs. He would record on one disc and then have that disc playing next to him while he recorded that to accompany him, and then he would basically overdub and record onto a separate disc, and he would manipulate the speeds and so on. You can hear this with Brazil in 1948, and we've already talked about the song Brazil last time. In that recording, you'll hear some of the guitars are moving at very fast speed. Those fast lines, that's not, he's a good guitarist, but he wasn't that good. He can't play that fast and that clean. So he's playing it at a slower tempo in a different key, and then he speeds it up. And that takes some doing, by the way, right? Speeding up and slowing down in that way. You have to always be very aware of how fast things, or how pitched things are, so that you can make it sound like it's all in the same key. So this is him developing sound on sound recording, or what we call overdubs, by adding an extra tape head. What he wound up doing was he added an extra tape head to his tape recorder so that he could record over what had previously been recorded. And that's the beginning of overdubs. And then Ampex draws on some of this innovation on the part of Les Paul. Now, this allowed for all sorts of things that you could do now, and it changes really the business approach to radio and the business approach to recording. Bing Crosby is a great example of that. Bing Crosby had a famous radio show. At this time, it was a variety show. He would come out and sing a song, and he'd talk about, things with guests, sometimes humorous things and sometimes just interviews, and do some skits. It was a variety show. Now, Bing Crosby, by this point in his career, he didn't want to be retired. He wanted the income, but at the same time, he was a famously laid-back guy, and he didn't want to work any harder than he had to. And he was a huge fan of golf. So he proposed that what he does is just record in a studio with an audience, record all of his show. His show was on 5 days a week. He wanted to record every episode of it back to back in a couple of days, and then take the rest of the month off. Right? So he would just have these long marathon recording sessions where he'd just do one after another and then take the rest of the day off. Now, they wouldn't let him do that on his original. I can't remember if he goes from NBC to CBS or vice versa. You can look that up. It doesn't matter. Whichever one it was, they wouldn't let him do it. they said, no, that's not how radio shows work. Radio shows are supposed to be live. You're supposed to feel the energy of the live audience and so on. And they thought some of that would be lost if he taped them all. So he quit. And he went to the other radio station and he said, would you let me do this? And of course, his radio show was very highly rated, so they were eager to have him. They're like, yeah, why not? We'll try it. So he began taping basically his shows live in the studio, but with just bring in a new audience for each one and just do them back to back, and then he could spend the rest of his time on the golf course. And pretty soon, more and more radio shows began to be recorded that way because you could do things. You could fix mistakes. You could overdub things for effects. Les Paul wound up having his own radio show that he taped in advance, and the whole thing is based around these various effects that he could create through manipulating the tape. By 1949, you have the 2-track recorder where overdubs, based on Les Paul's innovation, that you could do better overdubs with, and you could also create stereo effects where some sounds are coming out of one speaker and some sounds are coming out of another. So 1949, the beginning of stereo sound. This leads to other innovations. We have now this battle of the speeds. In 1948, Columbia Records introduces the long-playing album, the LP, right, which allowed for more than 20 minutes per side. Keep in mind that we've been mostly dealing with 3.5 minutes to 4 minutes per side. So the longest recordings of tunes that we've talked about so far were roughly 8 or maybe a little more than 8 minutes, where you're splitting the song in half and putting on both sides. That was the case, if you remember, with Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing with a Little Swing. It was also the case with some of the Ellington tunes that I didn't so much talk about, but now you had the LP, the long playing record. That's all LP means, long playing. And so you could have 20 minutes, more than 20 minutes per side. It was made of vinyl, and therefore it was less noisy than shellac. Remember, shellac had been banned for a while because it was useful for making bombs and weapons and artillery. So the first 10-inch, before the 12-inch, the first 10-inch was a re-release of The Voice of Frank Sinatra. The Voice of Frank Sinatra was in some ways the first album, but it was a literal album. And now, when you have a photo album, how does that work? You have one photo after another, right? And you just flip the pages. So you have a set of photos in one page, and then you flip and you have another set. That's what an album literally was. It was a collection of things leaved together. So, for instance, Schumann called some of his pieces, or collections of pieces, albums, because that's what they were. They were a collection of pieces. That's what album originally meant. So the first album was Frank Sinatra's The Voice, where it was a literal album. You bought this package, and inside it were a whole bunch of different discs with one song on each side. So each disc had 2 songs, one on each side. The re-release, the first album that we think of as an album, or the first 10-inch at least, was a re-release of this where they put many songs on each side, and I think they had to have 2 of them to cover the amount of songs that were in that album. The first 12-inch was Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, with Nathan Milstein playing the violin solo and Bruno Walter working as the conductor. By 1949, RCA Victor introduced the 45. This is totally different. A 45 is another single, just like the 78, but instead what it does is it plays at a different RPM, thus the battle of the speeds, and it uses a changer for a preset order. So in other words, if you have a 78, if you have the original kind of recording that most people would have, then you have a song on each side, and you have to flip it, and you can only play one, and when it's done, you play that one song, you take it off the recording, you can flip it and play the other song, or you can replace it and play another. If you have an album, then you put it down, and it can play through the whole one side of the album, then you have to flip it and play the other side, or replace it with another album. If you're playing a 45, and you have a changer, which is something my mom used to have when we were kids, and I always thought it was cool, a 45, and you have a changer, what you can do is you stack the 45s, and then after, it'll play the side of the lowest one, it'll drop down, play one side of the lowest one, then the needle picks up, the next one drops down, plays the top side of the next one, and so on. So you don't get to hear the other side, you'd have to flip it for that, but you can hear multiple singles one after another. So this is the battle of the speeds, these different technological options for playing playing your recordings. This is also the period of the rise of FM radio and, of course, television. FM radio starts in 1939, but it hits its stride in the 1950s with stereo broadcasting. That's when FM becomes important, because AM plays on mono, and FM allows for stereo broadcasting, and this is what helps to popularize it. And we'll see the importance when we talk more about the 1950s of FM radio. It really comes to define popular music in the 50s and then especially in the 60s. Television is first introduced in 1939, but it doesn't hit its stride until the late 40s with programs, comedy programs mostly, like The Honeymooners and so on, and then some variety programs and things like that. And eventually, the sound reproduction is good enough that you have these musical performances fairly early on in the career. I mean, obviously, even The Honeymooners has a theme song, and but when you hear old reruns of it, you'll hear that it doesn't stay perfectly in tune. There's a little mismatch there because of the synchronization. So Frank Sinatra. In 1935, Frank Sinatra is a member of a vocal quartet on a radio show called Major Beau's Amateur Hour. And it was really for semi-professionals. Amateur is maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but this is when he first is heard at all. Nobody cares about Frank Sinatra in 1935. In 1937 to 39, he's working in the great old state of New Jersey at the Rustic Cabin, and he's just a waiter, but he's a singing waiter. It's one of those kind of annoying restaurants, in my opinion, where the waiters walk around singing. But this one was wired for broadcast. That means that there was a microphone. Actually, there were a few. And they would switch from certain table to certain table so that you could hear it on a radio show. It must have been kind of annoying to hear because, of course, they're moving around, right? Waiting tables and singing. But still, that's what gets him his first exposure. And at the end of that, in 1939, he joins Harry James. And then later that same year, he joins the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. Tommy Dorsey is one of the most successful band leaders of the later part of the swing era, the second half of the swing era. He's also a notoriously difficult man and a difficult businessman. He's very canny. And so he has a pretty stringent contract with Frank Sinatra and gives Frank Sinatra a hard time getting out of it. Charges him a lot more than probably was necessary. In 1942, Frank Sinatra convinces Victor Records to allow him to make a solo recording. Remember, for the most part, singers aren't making solo recordings during the swing era. It's the bands that are making the recordings. The singers are the sort of side people, the side performers. So it's not like the vaudeville era of the 19-teens where there were plenty of famous Fanny Brice and Sophie Tucker and so on, where there were plenty of solo singers. During this period of the 30s, mid-30s through the early 40s, there aren't as many. There are solo singers, but they're just singing these solo moments in these big band arrangements. So it took some doing to convince Victor to do this, but he convinced them, and they helped him buy out his contract from Dorsey. And he starts appearing on the radio show Your Hit Parade. By December of 1942, he's at the Paramount Theater in New York City with Benny Goodman, and this is often considered the beginning, really, of the major portion of his career. Let's talk about that. So during the AFM strike, Columbia re-releases the recording he did with Harry James, the song All or Nothing at All. Now, this song was not that big of a hit in 1939 when it was originally released. And when it was released, it didn't mention that he was the singer at all, right? It doesn't even mention his name when you buy the record. It's a Harry James record. But when they re-release it under Sinatra's name, and they put Harry James as just the band leader. So now the tables have turned, so to speak, right? So this is a good example that during that AFM strike, the shift really moves toward the singers. So it appears under Sinatra's name, and it remains a bestseller for 18 weeks. It only makes it to number 2. It can't break into the number 1, but 18 weeks is a long time. And then in 1944, we have the Columbus Day riot. So we already had that Paramount appearance with Benny Goodman. This is a famous moment where a lot of the crowd bursts out when he says Frank Sinatra's name. He's barely even familiar with who Frank Sinatra is. He mentions Frank Sinatra's going to come out to sing, and he's so shocked by the people screaming in the audience that he literally says, and you have to remember, Benny Goodman is a very professional person. He's very polite in normal circumstances, but he's so shocked by this that he literally says, "What the F was that?" right? Into the microphone, and he regretted that. But he was so taken aback by the amount of noise being made for this new singer. By 44, Frank Sinatra is so well renowned that there's the Columbus Day riot. He was to perform a Columbus Day performance, a concert. Keep in mind that Columbus Day is, especially at that time, is still to some extent celebrated by Italian Americans as being a holiday that somehow represents Italian Americanness, right? There's the Italian American parades that often take place on Columbus Day. Well, that was even more the case in the 40s, the 30s through the 40s. That this was a major hallmark of Italianness. So this singer of Italian descent and who's singing this popular jazz music, he's giving a Columbus Day performance. They did something very stupid. They sold more tickets than they had. It's hard to tell whether that was intentional. It must have been to some extent. Somebody was trying to get away with something. So you have all these people that are lined up to hear Sinatra sing. They let the crowd in, and they get about, let's say 2/3 of the way through the line, and then they shut the doors. The auditorium was packed. And they tell people, many of whom have actual tickets, to go home, and they push their way in, and this is the riot, right? And a lot of these were young girls, so this is why it's sometimes called the Bobby Soxer phenomenon. These young girls, these fanatics for Frank Sinatra, because of the fashion of the day, they were known as the Bobby Soxers, and you hear references to this in films of the time and so on. In 1946, he releases the first album, and some people even think of it as the first concept album. I don't know if I buy that. We'll talk about a more likely candidate for the first concept album in a moment. And this was Columbia Records, Voice of Frank Sinatra, which was a set of 478, so it was literally an album. And then, as we said, it was re-released as a 10-inch later. This is more likely to be a real candidate for the first concept album. And this is also Frank Sinatra, of course. This is In the Wee Small Hours. Columbia and MCA, so his record company and his agency, they both drop him in 1952. In 1952, his reputation is in the toilet. He's breaking up with his wife. He was in a sort of celebrity marriage, and the scandal sheets say that he was treating her relatively poorly, and so people were sort of siding with her during all this. He had a few pretty bad flops when it came to his attempts at a acting career, which, at this point there weren't very many, and then some of his songs, he had some flops. He wasn't doing so well. So he gets dropped by both of them in 52. People figure his career's over. This is where the Godfather story comes in. Those of you who are fans of the movie Godfather, you might remember that there is a very wimpy crooner that comes to whine to the Godfather and makes an embarrassment of himself. And says, if you could only convince this guy to have me in his film, it would save my career. Well, this is supposedly the true story of what happens with Sinatra. There are different accounts, and I have no idea what's true and what's not. By now, it's a legend, and you know the old saying, when you're faced with the truth and the legend, print the legend. It's the one that everyone wants to hear. And so here's the legend. The legend is that he went up to a fairly famous mobster and cried at him, and just like in the movie, and he said, my career's in the toilet, but if I can get this secondary role in this film, it'll turn around my career. And that's exactly what happens. He gets the role, and in 1953 he wins Best Supporting Actor for a film, From Here to Eternity. From Here to Eternity is a war film. It depicts people that are in the armed forces. It has Montgomery Clift in it, one of those very reserved but celebrated actors of that period. And Sinatra plays the sort of sidekick role, but he also winds up getting tortured to death, and he dies. So he's got that sort of dramatic role. mileage varies. I think it's a crappy movie. I think he's crappy in it, but a lot of people loved it and thought he was wonderful in it. It's really a weepy movie. It has Burt Lancaster, has all these great actors. Deborah Carr has that famous scene where Burt Lancaster and Deborah Carr are making out on the beach that everyone thinks of as this great seductive scene of the early 50s. You see it for yourself. Make your own opinion. But that year, his career is revived, and he is signed to Capitol Records, and in 1955 he releases this album, which is his first 12-inch LP, so it's another landmark in the history of recording. It's on Capitol Records. We'll talk about the importance of Capitol Records soon with Nat King Cole, and this is In the Wee Small Hours. Now this one probably is kind of a concept album, because everything the orchestration is by Nelson Riddle, and it's got this sound that really pervades the whole thing. Everything is kind of linked in a way as far as the sound goes. All the songs are meant to be melancholy. They're meant to reflect on his divorce in some sense, even though they're not songs that he wrote. He's just picking, or Nelson Riddle picked these songs to have this certain feel. So this may be the first concept album. Another important crooner, maybe crooner is kind of a weird word for this guy perhaps, is Johnny Ray. Right, Sinatra clearly comes out of the crooning tradition. He's clearly drawing on Bing Crosby. He has his own kind of different phrasing, but Johnny Ray is also drawing on some of those same influences, but a much more ecstatic kind of approach to singing, much less reserved. He's sometimes dubbed the Prince of Wales. Get the joke? Because he's wailing, right, crying. Sometimes he's called the guy with the rubber face and the squirt gun eyes, because he literally cries on stage. Some claim he's one of the unremembered progenitors of rock and roll. They hear this as the beginnings of rock and roll. You listen and you decide. He had a highly emotional style that involved sobs, sighs, exaggerated delivery of text, and an emphasis on melisma on these long runs, right? And he would literally burst into tears while singing. There was something of the people would compare him sometimes to the Holy Rollers, right? These religious people who would try to convince large groups of people by being ecstatically moved, right, by their fervor for religion or whatever. So he is also one of the first singers to remove the microphone from the stand. You couldn't do that at first. That the stand needed all that wiring, and the wiring couldn't be displaced. But he, now technology is such that you can remove it from the stand, and that would allow him to go into the audience, right? So a lot like these kind of religious, immersive moments in that kind of holy roller touring religious spectacles. His huge hit was from 1951, and that's Cry, and that's, of course, the one that you would listen to. This is the number one pop and R&B hit. So this is a crossover hit. It's on both what then was still regarded as the white and black charts, the pop charts and the R&B charts. So this is a good example, one of the earliest examples, 1951, one of the early examples of a crossover hit. We saw some other crossover hits with Louis Jordan, so it's not, and there were some with Louis Armstrong as well. So it's not like this has never happened before, but it becomes a real trend in the 1950s, and this is one of the first from the 1950s that will help push that trend forward. Billie Holiday, another of the great singers of this period, for my money, the great singer of this period. Famous for her phrasing, very much behind the beat. Listen to how she pulls so far behind the beat at times as to almost break your sense of the metric structure, and then just resolves it beautifully. Just an amazing manipulation of rhythm. She thinks very much like a saxophone player. In fact, one of her closest friendships was with Lester Young, the saxophone player for Count Basie, and she sang with the Basie band for a little bit, as we'll see. She was discovered by John Hammond, so the Columbia A&R man that keeps showing up here, right? And she sang for a little bit with Benny Goodman. Then she signs to Brunswick Records and made several successful recordings with Teddy Wilson, and you remember him as the pianist for Benny Goodman, the black pianist in Benny Goodman's integrated band and in his big band. And this includes some of my favorites, Miss Brown to You, 1935. That was for a long time my absolute favorite recording, and still is one of my favorites. And Pennies from Heaven from 36. Those are both amazing pieces of singing, and you can hear her phrasing, and you can see how great of an accompanist Teddy Wilson is, because sometimes he gets drowned out in some of the Benny Goodman recordings, but here you can hear him so beautifully. Those are amazing recordings. She later plays and performs with Artie Shaw and Count Basie, and that's where, of course, she's working with Lester Young, and really learns a lot about phrasing, and probably teaches him a lot about phrasing, because she's already doing some pretty amazing work by the mid-30s. In the late 30s, she's performing at the Cafe Society. Now, that's one of the most interesting places of this period of the late 30s. This is a club that's designed for both black and white performers and black and white audience members and black and white staff and black and white the actual owner, Josephson, was white, but other people that helped run other parts of the management were black. So this was meant to be a fully integrated club at a time where that was fairly rare, right? We saw the Cotton Club had white audiences and black performers. That's not integrated. That's segregated, right? Just even though there are blacks and whites in the room, some are working and some are entertained. That's not the case at Cafe Society in the 30s. So it was a pretty important place in a lot of... This is the club where even Eleanor Roosevelt would go, right? And it was designed to sort of remind you of what it was doing. So, for instance, the people that were working the front door, the doormen, they wouldn't open the door for you. There were two black men that were hired to stand there and watch you open the door for yourself, as kind of almost a joke of this idea that there shouldn't be these kinds of social distinctions. It was here that she began singing the song Strange Fruit, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. She was signed to Columbia Records, but they refused to record that song, and Milt Gabler of Commodore Records recorded it, and it became a huge hit for her, in part because the jukebox hit Fine and Mellow was on the other side. Strange Fruit, she didn't want to sing it at first. She was convinced that this would not be a good idea. It was actually written by a high school teacher, and he was trying to describe the horror of lynching culture. Keep in mind that even though we're in the 1930s, we're now there for decades in the South. There had been a lynch, what we're referring to as lynching culture, right? And to say it that way, I don't know how else to say it. It is a culture of lynching, right? It makes it almost sound. I'm not trying to make it sound acceptable. But I think it's important to call it that, because we're not talking about isolated incidents. That's what people wanted you to believe at the time. Oh, well, that happens once in a while. That's when people get a little out of control. But it was an actual culture of the South, that it was an acceptable practice among many people, that you could get away with this, right? And there were several of them. It wasn't a once in a while kind of thing. It was happening a lot more than it should have ever been allowed to happen. The National Guard should have been called in. There should have been much more federal control than there was. But racial relations in the South were so fraught that people were hesitant to get involved, and plenty of the U.S. presidents from that period, from Woodrow Wilson through into the Roosevelt era, didn't want to get involved in it. The Roosevelts did to a certain extent. I don't know that they were as effective as they might have been. I would say that they were not. So this song directly talks about that. That's what Strange Fruit means. The strange fruit is a black man, hanging from a tree. Obviously, very upsetting imagery, and the song doesn't shirk it. It doesn't shy away from it. It faces it. Poetically, yes, but also openly. So you can understand that Billie Holiday, who is known largely as a torch singer, a singer of these romantic, somewhat seductive songs, but also songs of loss and lament, she might be somewhat hesitant, and she was. She threw the song at the guy who wrote it. She did not want to. She threw the manuscript back at him when she saw what the lyrics were about, and she had to be really cajoled into singing it. But once she sang it, she very much made it her own, and she made it into this kind of transformation of a torch song, transformation of what a jazz ballad can be and what it can represent. And so it's no wonder that this very controversial song, as it has to be, obviously, wound up being a hit for her. And she was quite shocked as well, and so was Columbia Records, and they later released another version of it to try to profit off of the thing that they were too afraid to put out originally. Another very important singer of this period is Nat King Cole. He was the pianist for the national tour of Shuffle Along. We talked about the importance of Shuffle Along. In 1938, he started appearing on radio, and he formed the Nat King Cole Trio and signed to Capitol Records in 1943. At this time, Capitol Records is an LA-based, soon they'll be both LA and Nashville-based, but they're an LA-based record company just starting. And it was partly owing to Cole's success with Capitol that they built the world's first circular office building near Hollywood and Vine in LA. It was completed in 1956, and it's one of the very famous buildings of LA. It's sometimes known as the house that Nat built, because it was built really on money earned from having him on their record company. The Nat King Cole Trio, that's one of the most important groups, really, of this period, in my opinion. They really came to define what the jazz trio would be. Notice that it's this version of it, and it was the most popular version for a while, is piano, guitar, and bass. No drums. Piano, guitar, and bass. Art Tatum and several other jazz greats emulated the Nat King Cole Trio, and expanded it to create Oscar Peterson also to create the standard trio sound, and then the quartet sound would be that same thing, but with drums, and all of that is built off of Nat King Cole's example. So Art Tatum, Oscar Peterson, Ahmad Jamal. In 1943, he has his first mainstream hit with his composition, Straighten Up and Fly Right. This is based on a black folktale and apparently a sermon that he had heard. His version of it, of course. It sold over 500,000 copies, so a major hit for him. And it establishes his trio. It also is a vocal hit. So a lot of the early recordings with the Nat King Cole Trio, many of them are instrumental. But early on in their career, when they were playing around Hollywood and LA and getting gigs, and you're still talking about an era of great racial prejudice, even in a more or less enlightened, for lack of a better word, city like LA. And he was playing a gig, and one of the customers said, why don't you sing a song? And he's like, well, no, that's not what I really do. We're playing jazz instrumentals. And the owner of the club came over to him and said, if a patron wants you to sing, you sing, or you'll lose the gig. So he threatened him. So he sang, I think the song was Sweet Lorraine, which of course becomes a big hit for Nat King Cole. At least that's the legend, right? That it was Sweet Lorraine. And of course, Nat King Cole is one of the great singers. So even though this came about because somebody insisted that he sing when he didn't particularly want to sing, and that's not right, of course, at the same time, it allowed for a string of very important recordings, and it allowed for the emergence of one of the most, I think, charismatic and really amazing voices in jazz singing, Nat King Cole's. His phrasing, the clarity of his pitch is just amazing. Listen to his version of Stardust if you want proof of that. There is no better version as far as the clarity of the voice and the clarity of pitch. So he becomes one of the great crossover artists. In 1946, he's paid to have a radio show, the King Cole Trio Time. This is the first program with a black artist that has a sponsor, right? There were other black artists that had radio shows. Louis Armstrong, for a very brief moment, tried to have a radio show, but they couldn't get a national sponsor, and Nat King Cole had one. In 1948, he releases Nature Boy. That's not my favorite song, but his singing of it is amazing, and he's using more and more of this orchestral background, so no longer just the trio. Mona Lisa in 1950, Too Young was a #1 hit. Unforgettable, They're both hits of his from 1951. Then he has 14 hits in the top 10 pop charts. So a crossover, not R&B charts, the pop charts. Basically, at this time, it's still white audiences that we're tracking when we're talking about the pop charts. Between 46 and 54, he has a string of 14 top 10 hits. In November 5th of 1956, he begins the Nat King Cole Show on NBC TV. This is the first variety show hosted by an African American on television. He couldn't get a national sponsor. This was a step too far. He had a national sponsor for his radio show, but NBC just couldn't get him a national sponsor. And so even though he was broadcast to the South, remember how broadcasting works, especially this time. You could, and really it works this way. I don't know if it still works this way today, but it still worked this way in the 90s. That you could have a nationally broadcast show that a local station could decide not to play, right? So even though NBC says, here's the show we're putting out for the 8 o'clock hour, and that would be the Nat King Cole Show on, I forget what day it was, doesn't matter. A local station can override that and play whatever they want. So a lot of the local stations in the South were refusing to play the Nat King Cole Show because there was still something considered too threatening about having a black performer on. You gotta remember that the first sitcom is also in the 1950s, and that's the Amos and Andy Show. That's the first sitcom to feature an all-black cast, and that also wasn't played by all the local stations, even though it was a national show. So there's still this issue about representing black people on television. That's an issue all the way into the 1950s. I mean, not that any of us thought the 1950s were some kind of racially integrated period. This is the beginning of that, of course, in 1955 and 54. And the 54 was the Brown versus the Board of Education, and we'll talk about that more soon. So it's an important moment, but it's still a moment of a great deal of struggle, a great deal of obstacles that are still being thrown in people's way. And we'll continue to talk about that in upcoming sessions. So that's it for this one, and I'll see you at the next session.